We all know what happened in Flint, Michigan. There are many stories about why it happened, and lots of blame to go around. But the real story is the ugly truth that our country has failed over and over again to face: our own systemic racism. Systemic racism is what poisoned Flint residents and what prevents them from attaining justice. In April 2014, Governor Rick Snyder, with the emergency managers and advisors he appointed, switched Flint's water source to save money. During the switch, the government temporarily supplied Flint residents with water from the Flint River. The safeguards used to prevent leaching of lead into water were not put in place in Flint. Almost immediately, citizens complained about dirty, foul-tasting water. City officials repeatedly insisted to residents that the water was safe to drink, even though it was highly contaminated with lead. In October 2015, the city switched back to the Detroit water supply, but it was too late to reverse the damage to the pipes and to many Flint residents. It has been over 3 years since Flint has had clean water. But why did this happen in Flint? The decision to change water sources may have gone through technically race-neutral decision systems, but the power dynamics of race and poverty cannot be ignored.
No, they did it because it's a black city, it's a poor city. They wouldn't do this to Bloomfield Hills or Ann Arbor or Grosse Pointe.
The decision to change Flint's water supply was made by the ultimate in-group. In contrast, the mostly poor and black residents of Flint were outsiders. They had no say in the decision-making process, not even through elected representatives, as Flint was under emergency state management. Even if the decision-makers didn't anticipate the results of changing the water supply, they made Flint residents bear the risks. As a social, political, and economic outgroup, it would be harder for these minorities to realize their vulnerability and fight back. In fact, in 2017, the State of Michigan Civil Rights Commission found that the Flint water crisis was the result of systemic racism and was just one of many racial inequities in the state. As the media criticized the state in-group, the state fired back by blaming the out-group, the Flint resident victims. Snyder's chief of staff wrote in an email, quote, "Some in Flint are taking the very sensitive issue of children's exposure to lead and trying to turn it into a political football, trying to shift responsibility to the state." In a way, he was right. The children of Flint had become a political football. But whose responsibility was it? As the Michigan Civil Rights Commission wrote, because our legal system is built around the notion of identifying and then holding bad actors responsible for bad outcomes, it often does not provide the tools necessary to address bad outcomes that lack either a clearly identifiable cause or intentional animus. So a grave injustice was done in Flint, one that will affect the community for decades to come.
When the government official, who might have been a consultant, decided that to save money, they switched the source of water from the Detroit River to the Flint River, that was about as gross criminal negligence you can imagine.
Surely people will be held accountable and harms remedied, right? Various criminal charges have been filed, although plea deals are being brokered and felonies are getting reduced to misdemeanors. The criminal justice system might punish a few of the bad actors, but that will do nothing to compensate the residents of Flint for their injuries. In order to win a civil suit, the plaintiffs will need to show that the actions taken by city, county, and state officials were the proximate cause of their harm. This presents a significant problem. Lead is extraordinarily toxic, but the residents of Flint will have trouble proving causation because stereotypes of poor black people and the harms of poverty mirror the harms of lead poisoning. 42% of Flint's population lives in poverty, and nationwide, black children are already 3 times more likely than white children to have elevated blood lead levels. On top of that, the harmful effects of lead poisoning could take decades to appear, which makes it harder and harder to trace any individual problem directly back to that lead exposure, rather than some other life event. So while drinking lead in water definitely harms Flint residents, it will be extremely difficult to prove in court that one person's difficulty graduating from high school or another's kidney failure was a direct result of Flint's water. Sovereign immunity, which allows the state to avoid responsibility for decisions made while performing core government functions, is another obstacle. In other words, when performing your role as a state official, you are subject to situational forces and therefore cannot be held accountable for dispositionist actions. Claims to discredit state sovereign immunity are hard to prove. Despite the fact that Snyder, as head of state, has admitted that the government failed, it is unlikely that a court will waive this immunity. Even if Flint residents were successful in avoiding sovereign immunity claims and proving causation, the last major hurdle they would face is in damage calculations. When assessing damages, courts use projections for average lifetime earnings to determine how much money the victim would have earned had they not been injured. This becomes tricky when the victims are children. The court does not have a strong basis for these earning projections. Remember that in Flint, the most affected victims of lead poisoning are children. In these cases, courts use tables that take into account a victim's gender, race, and education level to ascertain their average projected earnings. In other words, racial and gender bias is explicitly built into the system for awarding damages. As a result, a white person's life is worth more than a black one's in our legal system, and a man's life is worth more than a woman's. Washington Post reporter Kim Sofin has more.
I think the big overarching theme here, the stated goal in the U.S. is to compensate someone for how much they would have earned or would not have spent in medical bills if the accident never occurred. And that's what is really in effect leading to these race and gender gaps, because if that is your goal, then using these averages definitely gets you closer to that goal. But I think that what people need to realize is that that's not the only goal that you can have. If you look at a country like Israel, they have this system set up so that for a given type of accident, you get a certain compensation regardless of your personal details, which gets rid of all of this gender and race messiness. And it's just a question of, is that the kind of system that we want to live with, or do we like the one that we have?
As the Flint water crisis shows, the system that we have is unacceptable. Too often, the disadvantages of people of color and poor people are compounded by our legal system. If we could reimagine tort law to live up to its promise of being the people's recourse, decision makers would be deterred from making reckless decisions, knowing that they will be held accountable, and Flint residents would get justice. We should limit sovereign immunity for appointed rather than elected officials, expand our understanding of causation to encompass multi-vector issues and latent effects, acknowledge power dynamics between advantaged and disadvantaged groups, and calculate damages based on the harm that occurred and not the identity of the victim. We believe this is the only way to make sure that a crisis like Flint's never happens again.